My name is Charles Whitman. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life I've worked in environments where performance is measured quietly, by metrics, by deadlines met, by problems solved before they become visible. I've never been the loudest person in the room. I don't command attention when I walk in, and that's often shaped how people see me before they actually know me. People tend to underestimate me, not out of cruelty, usually, but out of habit. I'm the kind of person who listens more than he speaks. I take notes. I ask clarifying questions instead of making declarations. In group settings, that often gets translated as passivity, as if calm equals compliance, as if silence means agreement. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or painting myself as a hero. It's about something quieter than that. It's about how systems work when communication fails, about what happens when decisions are made around someone instead of with them, and about what it feels like to realize that your name has been moving through rooms you've never been invited into. I want to be clear about something up front. Everything I'm about to tell you is honest as I experienced it. There's no dramatization here, no shouting matches or cinematic showdowns. What happened unfolded slowly, through emails, meetings, omissions, and assumptions. The kind of story that, from the outside, might look like nothing at all, until you're the one living inside it. At its core, this is a story about awareness. About the moment you realize you've been assigned a role you never agreed to play. About learning the difference between patience and invisibility. And about choosing restraint not because you're afraid to act, but because you understand the long-term consequences of acting too soon. You'll hear about professional trust and how fragile it can be. You'll hear about silence, how it can be mistaken for weakness, and how it can also become a form of leverage when used deliberately. And you'll hear about the emotional cost of discovering things indirectly, through tone shifts, forwarded messages, and conversations that suddenly go quiet when you enter the room. There's no triumph at the end of this story. No public vindication. What there is clarity, a kind of internal recalibration that changes how you move through the world afterward. I'm sharing this not to warn you and not to instruct you, but to document what it felt like to stand still while everything else subtly rearranged itself around me. If you've ever sensed that something important was happening just beyond your line of sight. If you've ever wondered how often decisions get made without the people they affect most. Then maybe, as you listen, you'll recognize parts of yourself in this story too. Before we go any further, have you ever had the feeling that you were the last person to be told about something that concerned you the most? For a long time, I thought being dependable was enough. At work, I was known as the person who handled things. Not in a flashy way. More like a background process that kept running no matter what else broke. If a deadline was slipping, my name came up. If a report needed to be cleaned up before leadership saw it, someone forwarded it to me. If a new hire had questions no one else had time for, I was the one they were quietly sent to. People didn't say this out loud, but I could feel it in the way conversations flowed. I was the constant, the safe option, the one who wouldn't make noise. In meetings, I usually sat slightly off to the side, not physically, but conversationally. I spoke when asked. When I disagreed, I framed it carefully, with data and context, not ego. When others talked over me, I let it go. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed timing mattered. I assumed that consistency would eventually speak for itself. From the outside, I imagine I looked agreeable, flexible, easy to manage. That perception followed me everywhere. Managers trusted me, but they didn't consult me. Colleagues relied on me, but rarely credited me. When projects succeeded, the praise floated upward. When something stalled, it drifted sideways, often landing on my desk with a polite note attached. Can you take a look at this? You're good at smoothing these things out. Just need someone steady on this. Steady. That word came up a lot. There was no malice in it. That's important. No one was trying to sideline me. They were just operating on a quiet assumption that I would always be there, always capable, always willing, and always fine with being unseen. I reinforced that assumption myself. I didn't correct people when they minimized my role. I didn't interrupt to reclaim credit. I told myself it didn't matter, that my work spoke louder than titles or recognition, that I didn't need to be visible to be valuable. But over time, something subtle happened. My identity inside the organization became narrower than who I actually was. I wasn't seen as someone with opinions or strategic insight or limits. I was seen as a function, reliable, useful, invisible. When leadership talked about the team, My name was included only in the abstract. When decisions were made, they were often presented to me as conclusions, not discussions. I'd be looped in at the end, with just enough context to execute, but not enough to influence. And I accepted that. Part of me believed that patience was a virtue, that staying composed while others rushed around was a form of strength. Another part of me, quieter, easier to ignore, felt something closer to erosion, like being slowly worn down, not by force but by absence. Absence of acknowledgement, absence of invitation, absence of voice. Still, if you had asked me then, I would have said everything was fine. I told myself I was playing the long game, that being underestimated could be useful, that visibility came with politics, and politics came with costs I didn't want to pay. I watched others burn out chasing recognition, and I convinced myself I was wiser for staying grounded. But wisdom and invisibility aren't the same thing. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my role was, to everyone but me. I was the person you leaned on without asking how much weight they were already carrying. The one whose silence was interpreted as consent. The one whose calm made it easy to forget that there was a boundary at all. No one asked me what I wanted next. No one checked whether I agreed with the direction things were moving. They assumed I would adapt. Because I always had. At that stage, I didn't feel wronged. I felt replaceable. And oddly enough, that realization didn't come with anger, it came with clarity. I was being seen exactly as I had trained people to see me, and I didn't yet understand how costly that perception would become. The first time something felt off, it didn't announce itself. There was no confrontation, no email marked urgent, no meeting where the tone shifted dramatically. It was smaller than that, so small in fact that I almost talked myself out of noticing it at all. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because Tuesdays were usually quiet. Fewer meetings, more room to focus. I was reviewing a workflow update, one I'd helped design months earlier, when a colleague messaged me asking if I'd seen the latest version. I hadn't, so I clicked the link she sent. The document was familiar, but altered. Sections reworded, a few structural changes. My original logic was still there, but rearranged, simplified, and, most notably, unsigned. The contributors list at the top had been updated. My name wasn't on it. Instead, there were two others, both junior to me. Both people I'd walked through the framework step by step when it was still rough and incomplete. At first, I assumed it was an oversight. That's the generous explanation, the one you reach for when you don't want to believe anything else. I told myself it would be corrected once the final version went out, or that maybe there was another draft floating around with proper attribution. Still, something tightened in my chest. I scrolled through those comments. My phrasing adjusted, my cautions softened, my edge cases removed entirely. The document was cleaner, but also riskier, and yet it was being circulated as an improvement. I checked the timestamp. It had already been shared with leadership. No one had told me. That was the cut. Small, precise, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. Later that day, I sat in on a meeting where the update was discussed. I listened as one of the contributors explained the thinking behind the changes. He spoke confidently, as if the ideas had come fully formed. No hesitation, no glance in my direction. I waited for someone to acknowledge my earlier work. They didn't. I considered speaking up, not defensively, just to clarify context. But the conversation moved quickly, and I told myself it wasn't worth disrupting the flow, that correcting the record could be done later, privately. So I stayed quiet. After the meeting, I checked my inbox. There was an internal email thread I hadn't been included on. It referenced the update as a fresh approach. There was a sentence that stood out to me, not because it was harsh, but because it was casual. Let's see how this performs before we loop Charles back in. Loop me back in, as if I had stepped away. As if I hadn't been there from the beginning. As if my involvement was optional. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. That was when I felt it. Not anger, not betrayal, but something colder. A recalibration. The realization that my absence from that thread wasn't accidental. It was procedural. They had moved on without thinking to check whether I should be part of the decision. And the most unsettling part, no one else noticed. The junior analysts didn't seem uncomfortable. Leadership didn't ask where the framework came from. The system had absorbed the change seamlessly, as if this version of events made perfect sense. I went home that night and replayed the day in my head. I asked myself whether I was overreacting. Whether this was just how collaborative environments worked, ideas evolving, ownership blurring. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had shifted, not in the work, but in how I was being positioned relative to it. This wasn't a conflict, it was a quiet exclusion, a signal, subtle enough to ignore but clear enough to register if you were paying attention. And once you notice something like that, it changes how you listen, how you read emails, how you interpret silence. I didn't say anything, not then. I told myself it was a one-off, a misunderstanding, a small cut that would heal on its own. I didn't yet understand that small cuts, when left unaddressed, don't bleed. They numb. After that first moment, I became more attentive, not suspicious, just observant. There's a difference. Suspicion looks for enemies. Observation just notices patterns. And once I started noticing, it became harder to ignore how often the same small exclusions repeated themselves, each one easy to explain away on its own. I wasn't invited to a planning call because it was last minute. I wasn't copied on a follow-up because it was already handled. My feedback was acknowledged with a polite "good point" and then quietly bypassed. Nothing overt. Nothing you could escalate without sounding unreasonable. That's how normalization works. Disrespect doesn't arrive all at once. It spreads thinly, diluted by plausible explanations, until it feels petty to object to it. Until you start questioning your own sensitivity, rather than the behavior itself. And I helped it along. When someone summarized my input inaccurately, I corrected it gently, if at all. When credit drifted away from me, I told myself recognition wasn't the goal. When my role was reduced to execution rather than strategy, I framed it as efficiency. They probably just need someone reliable on delivery. Leadership doesn't need every voice in the room. This isn't personal. It's just how things move fast. Each explanation sounded reasonable, mature even. The kind of rationalization that lets you feel above the friction instead of inside it. But something else was happening beneath that calm surface. I was being trained, slowly, to expect less. Less involvement, less transparency, less respect for my perspective. And because I didn't push back, the system adjusted accordingly. Not out of malice, but out of momentum. People tend to follow the path of least resistance, and I had made myself very easy to move around. I noticed how meetings were scheduled, how agendas were framed before I ever saw them, how decisions were increasingly presented as updates rather than questions. My presence became ceremonial, a checkbox, proof that stakeholders were informed even if they hadn't been consulted. The most unsettling part was how normal it started to feel. I'd open my inbox and scan threads I wasn't part of, piecing together context from replies. I'd hear about changes secondhand and adjust my work without comment. I'd nod in meetings where I should have asked why something had shifted, and each time I told myself I was choosing peace over friction. But peace that requires you to shrink isn't peace, it's avoidance. There were moments, brief, uncomfortable ones, where I considered drawing a line, asking directly why I hadn't been included, clarifying ownership, reasserting my role. But I hesitated, not because I was afraid of conflict, but because I didn't want to seem defensive. That's the trap. When you're calm by nature, asserting yourself can feel like a betrayal of your own identity. You worry that the moment you speak up, you'll be misread, that your restraint will suddenly be labeled as attitude, that the quiet person has finally become difficult. So you stay quiet, and the label never changes. Over time, I realized that people weren't responding to who I was. They were responding to who I had consistently appeared to be. Someone adaptable, someone agreeable, someone who would absorb inconvenience without complaint. That perception became a kind of permission to decide without me, permission to edit my work without acknowledgement, permission to assume I'd adjust. And because I kept adjusting, the permission was never revoked. There's a particular loneliness in that kind of environment. Not isolation, you're surrounded by people all day, but a sense that you're slightly out of phase with the room. That conversations are happening at a frequency you're not tuned into. That by the time you hear about something, it's already settled. I remember sitting at my desk one afternoon, listening to the low hum of the office, and realizing that no one had asked for my opinion on anything meaningful in weeks. Not because I lacked expertise, but because the system no longer expected it from me. That was the moment I stopped telling myself this was temporary. Disrespect had become ambient, part of the background noise. And like any background noise, it was easiest to endure by pretending it wasn't there. But endurance has a cost. It teaches people how to treat you. It teaches you what you're willing to accept. And the longer you normalize something, the harder it becomes to challenge it. Because by then, everyone else has forgotten there was ever another way. I hadn't reached a breaking point yet. There was no anger, no confrontation, no dramatic realization, just a quiet understanding. This wasn't an anomaly anymore. It was a pattern. The clarity didn't arrive all at once. It settled in gradually, like a label you don't notice until you realize it's been stuck to you for a while. I wasn't just being overlooked. I was being used correctly, according to a role I'd never consciously agreed to. Once I saw that, everything else started to make sense. I was the stabilizer. The one brought in after decisions were made, not before. The person you handed complexity to, so it would stop being a problem. I wasn't expected to shape direction, only to ensure the direction held. In meetings, this showed up in subtle ways. People would say things like, "Charles can make that work," or "Let's run it by Charles once we're aligned." Not with Charles, by Charles. I was a checkpoint, not a contributor, and again, no one was being cruel. That's what made it harder to name. They spoke about me with confidence, even respect. They trusted my competence deeply, but they didn't see me as someone whose agreement mattered, because I'd never required it. Over time, my calendar reflected this role perfectly. Fewer exploratory meetings, more execution-heavy ones. Fewer brainstorming sessions. More quick syncs that weren't quick at all. I was looped in when things needed to be fixed, smoothed, or documented, never when they were being decided. I noticed how newer hires were introduced, how some were framed as future leaders, others as strategic thinkers. My introduction never changed. "This is Charles. He knows how everything works." That was true, and it was also limiting. Knowing how everything works doesn't mean you get to influence how it should work. It just means you're responsible for keeping it from breaking, and I'd become very good at that. The role came with an unspoken expectation, emotional neutrality. I wasn't supposed to have preferences, or ambitions, or reactions. My calm demeanor had been interpreted as emotional availability without emotional needs. If I stayed late, it was assumed I didn't mind. If I took on extra work, it was assumed I had capacity. If I didn't object, it was assumed I agreed. The role required silence, and I had perfected it. What struck me most was how predictable it all was. Once I understood the role, I could see the pattern before it played out. A decision would be made upstream. A problem would emerge downstream. I'd be brought in to resolve it, efficiently and quietly. The cycle would reset. No one asked whether this was sustainable, or fair, or aligned with my goals, because the role didn't include goals, only functions. There was a moment, small but telling, when someone joked in a meeting, "Charles will figure it out, he always does." Everyone laughed. I smiled too, out of reflex. But inside, something hardened, not into anger, but into resolve. I realized that as long as I kept smiling, the role would never change. Why would it? It worked beautifully for everyone else. I went back through old emails, old project docs, old threads. I saw how often my contributions had been foundational, and how rarely they were acknowledged in final summaries, not erased, just absorbed, like infrastructure. You don't praise a bridge for holding weight, you just cross it. That's when it hit me. I had been assigned permanence without authority, responsibility without agency, trust without voice, and the most uncomfortable truth of all, I had helped build the assignment by staying agreeable, by prioritizing harmony over clarity, by believing that being indispensable was the same as being valued. They weren't wrong about me. They were responding logically to the version of me I had consistently presented. But roles once assigned are hard to escape, especially when they're invisible, especially when they benefit everyone else. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand a reset. I didn't announce a boundary. Not yet. But for the first time, I stopped asking myself why they treated me this way and started asking a different question instead. What happens if I stop fulfilling the role they expect? The shift didn't come with a decision. It came with a pause. It was a quiet morning, early enough that the office hadn't filled in yet. I remember because the lights above my desk were still dimmed, and the city outside the windows looked unfinished, like it was still loading. I had arrived early out of habit, not urgency. There was no crisis waiting for me, no email marked high priority. Just space. I was reviewing an internal update when I noticed something strange. Not alarming, just off. A sentence referenced a process change that hadn't been discussed with me. That wasn't unusual anymore. What was unusual was that the change intersected directly with an area I was accountable for, not adjacent to, not downstream. Directly, I reread the paragraph. Then I searched my inbox. Nothing. No meeting invite, no request for input, no mention of a discussion I might have missed. The change was already framed as implemented. Normally, I would have adjusted, sent a polite clarification, asked for context, filled in the gaps, and moved on. But that morning, I didn't. I leaned back in my chair and just sat there, reading the sentence again. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. I felt something closer to detachment, like watching a familiar pattern finally complete itself. This wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a confirmation. They had crossed a line they didn't know existed, because I'd never drawn it. And in that moment, something subtle but irreversible shifted inside me. I realized I was no longer disappointed. Disappointment implies expectation. Hope. The belief that things should be different. What I felt instead was clarity. Clean, almost relieving clarity. I understood exactly where I stood. I closed the document without responding. That was the shift. Not action. Inaction, chosen deliberately, not reflexively. For the rest of the morning, I worked as usual. Answered messages, completed tasks, spoke when spoken to. Nothing outwardly changed. But internally, my relationship to the environment had altered. I stopped filling in blanks they didn't ask me to fill. I stopped preemptively solving problems no one had acknowledged. I stopped volunteering context that others had decided they didn't need. I wasn't withdrawing, I was observing. I watched how long it took for someone to notice the gap. How often assumptions replaced communication. How decisions created downstream friction that no one could quite diagnose. By mid-afternoon, someone messaged me. "Hey, quick question about that new process. Just want a sanity check." I read it, and for the first time, I didn't rush to respond. Not out of spite. Out of curiosity. What happens if I don't immediately reassert myself into a system that's already decided I'm optional? I replied later. Briefly. Factually. Without filling in the strategic reasoning they hadn't asked for. The conversation stalled. That's when I understood the true nature of the role I'd been playing. I wasn't just executing work. I was cushioning consequences, softening edges, making other people's incomplete decisions appear smoother than they were. Without that cushion, things didn't break. They just became visible. That day ended without incident, no confrontation, no escalation. But as I packed up to leave, I felt lighter, not because anything had improved, but because I had stopped carrying something that was never formally assigned to me in the first place. On the way home, I thought about all the times I'd told myself silence was patience, that calm was maturity, that staying agreeable was the same as being professional. I realized I'd been confusing stillness with agency. The shift wasn't about asserting dominance. It wasn't about reclaiming status. It was about choosing where my energy went and where it didn't. That morning marked the end of something quiet but significant. It was the last day I interpreted exclusion as something to correct. From then on, I treated it as information. And information, once seen clearly, changes how you move, whether anyone else notices yet or not. Silence. When it's no longer automatic, feels different. Before, my quiet had been instinctive, a reflex shaped by personality and habit. I stayed silent because that's how I'd always navigated the world. Observe first, speak later, avoid unnecessary friction. It wasn't strategic. It was simply who I was. But after that shift, silence became deliberate. I stopped explaining myself unless asked. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been voiced. I stopped smoothing over gaps that others had created through haste or assumption. And almost immediately, people misread it. They assumed I was busy, or disengaged, or just having an off week. No one imagined that my quiet was intentional, because intention had never been something they associated with my silence before. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. In meetings, I spoke less, but when I did, I spoke precisely. I didn't offer context unless it was requested. I answered the question in front of me, not the one people wished they'd asked. My contributions became smaller, sharper, harder to reinterpret. Some people filled the space I left behind. They talked more, explained more, made confident assertions with incomplete information, and because I didn't immediately correct them, their confidence went unchallenged. At first, that made them louder. Then it made them exposed. I watched decisions ripple outward without my usual stabilizing presence. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to slow things down, just enough ambiguity to surface questions that had previously been buried under my quiet competence. I noticed how often people reached for me after the fact. "Hey, quick thing. Does this make sense? Can you double-check this? Something feels off." And I can't quite tell why. I answered honestly, but narrowly. Yes, that's consistent with what was discussed. No, that wasn't part of the original framework. That depends on what outcome you're prioritizing. No rescuing, no reframing, no invisible labor. Some conversations ended awkwardly, others didn't end at all. That was new. Silence had changed the dynamic. It was no longer a cushion, it was a mirror. People began to see the gaps they'd previously assumed I was filling automatically. A few seemed unsettled by it. They'd pause longer when I didn't jump in. They'd rephrase questions, as if trying to unlock the version of me they were used to. The one who anticipated, clarified, and absorbed. That version didn't disappear. He just stopped volunteering. And because there was no announcement, no explanation, the shift unsettled people more than any confrontation would have. You can argue with words, you can dismiss complaints, but you can't easily argue with absence, especially when it's quiet and consistent. I was careful not to weaponize it. That mattered to me. I didn't withhold information that was required. I didn't let things fail out of spite. I fulfilled my responsibilities exactly as defined. No more, no less. If something needed my sign-off, I gave it. If something required my input, I provided it. But if no one asked, I let the silence stand. This was the point where others began mistaking my restraint for weakness. I could see it in their tone, the slight condescension creeping into messages, the way some spoke around me in meetings, summarizing decisions as if I weren't fully present. The assumption that my lack of pushback meant alignment. I let them think that, not because I lacked conviction, but because I finally understood leverage. Leverage isn't about force, it's about position, about knowing which actions are expected of you and which ones are simply assumed. When you stop fulfilling assumptions, the system reveals itself. I started documenting more carefully, not obsessively, quietly. Dates, decisions, threads I wasn't included on, changes that intersected with my scope without consultation. No accusations, no commentary, just facts. This wasn't preparation for conflict, it was preparation for clarity. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. Not anxious, not resentful, calm. Like someone who had finally stopped arguing with reality and started working with it instead. Silence, chosen deliberately, gave me distance. Distance gave me perspective, and perspective made one thing clear. As long as I remained predictably quiet, others would continue to underestimate what I noticed and how much I understood. And that underestimation created space. Space to watch, space to document, space to decide what I would and would not be part of going forward. I wasn't moving yet, but I was no longer standing still by accident. What they never noticed wasn't dramatic. There was no secret meeting, no sudden transformation, no visible shift in my demeanor that would have raised alarms. From the outside, I was still the same, calm, reliable, present. I showed up. I delivered what was asked. I didn't challenge authority or posture for attention. That's why they missed what was happening underneath. While my silence created space, I used that space deliberately. I began paying closer attention to process, not people. To how decisions actually moved through the organization, not how they were described in meetings. I noticed which approvals were required and which were merely customary. Which voices were considered essential and which were included only for optics. I started mapping dependencies, not formally, just mentally at first, then in notes. Who relied on which reports, which teams depended on which data feeds, where institutional knowledge lived and where it didn't. It became clear, very quickly, that a lot of what I handled wasn't documented anywhere else. I had always known how things worked. What changed was that I stopped assuming everyone else did too. I reviewed old handoffs, archived decisions, and long-forgotten threads. Not to relive slights, but to understand history. The rationale behind systems that were now treated as immovable. The compromises that had been made quietly to keep things running. In many cases, I had been the one to make those compromises, and no one remembered. That wasn't an insult, it was a vulnerability. I also noticed how often language replaced clarity. Words like alignment, visibility, ownership. They were used liberally, but rarely defined. Decisions hid behind them. Accountability diffused through them. So I stopped relying on language. I relied on artifacts. I saved versions. I archived emails. I kept copies of approvals and scope definitions. Not obsessively, not defensively, methodically. What surprised me most was how little effort this required once I stopped doing everything else. All the extra labor, the anticipatory fixes, the context building, the smoothing, had been consuming far more energy than the documentation ever did. Without that noise, patterns emerged. I saw how often decisions were justified after the fact, how outcomes were reframed as intentions, how responsibility subtly shifted when results were mixed. And I saw something else too. I saw how often my name appeared in places I wasn't included, referenced, assumed, invoked as a safeguard. Charles has this covered. Charles will flag if there's an issue. Charles signed off previously. Sometimes that last one wasn't even true. No one checked. They didn't notice that my actual sign-off had become less frequent, that my approvals were narrower, that my language had shifted from advisory to conditional. I wasn't trying to catch anyone out. I was trying to understand the system well enough to know where I actually stood within it. And what I learned was this. The organization didn't run on hierarchy, it ran on memory. And I held more of that memory than almost anyone else. The systems worked because I remembered why certain shortcuts existed, why certain risks were tolerated, why certain metrics were weighted the way they were. Remove that memory, and the system wouldn't collapse, but it would stumble, repeatedly, quietly, in ways that were hard to diagnose. They never noticed that I had stopped compensating for that. They also never noticed that I was learning, not new technical skills, I already had those. I was learning governance, policy, risk language, how decisions were defended when questioned externally, how accountability was framed when something went wrong. I learned who documented decisions carefully and who relied on verbal consensus, who asked questions in writing, and who preferred hallway alignment, who avoided leaving a trail. That last group interested me most. All of this happened in plain sight. I didn't stay late. I didn't withdraw socially. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. I simply became exact. Exact in what I agreed to. Exact in what I documented. Exact in what I no longer assumed. And because exactness looks like neutrality from a distance, no one paid attention. There's a particular kind of blindness that comes from familiarity. When someone has always been calm, you stop watching them. You stop interpreting their behavior as meaningful. You assume continuity. That assumption gave me time. Time to understand leverage without using it. Time to see consequences before they unfolded. Time to decide whether I even wanted to intervene anymore. By the time anyone realized something had changed, the change had already been in place for weeks. And by then, it wasn't something that could be undone with a conversation. Because what they never noticed wasn't that I had become quieter. It was that I had stopped being informal. And in systems like this, informality is what keeps things flexible and unaccountable. I hadn't acted yet, but the ground beneath the process was already different. The reveal didn't come as a shock. That surprised me most, when I finally saw it, clearly, undeniably. Deniably, I didn't feel panic or anger. I felt confirmation, like the last piece of a picture clicking into place, not changing the image, just sharpening it. It happened late in the afternoon, during one of those lulls when most people had mentally checked out. I was looking for something else entirely, an old approval chain tied to a process question, when I opened an internal thread that wasn't meant for me. It wasn't confidential in the dramatic sense. No warnings, no restricted tags, just a misrouted reply in a long email chain, forwarded without much thought. That's how these things usually surface. I scrolled slowly, already aware that I was reading something I wasn't supposed to see. The tone was familiar, managerial, measured, careful with language. The kind of language that tries to sound objective while making subjective judgments feel procedural.
And there you are,
Sire, it was a summary of concerns, a note about patterned behavior, a recommendation for documentation. My name appeared several times, not in accusation, in framing. I read the entire thread twice before it fully registered what I was looking at. I found out I'd been written up through an internal email, not formally delivered, not discussed with me, not even acknowledged as something I should be aware of. Just decided. The comments weren't cruel. That almost made it worse. They were sanitized, distant, abstract. Observations about communication gaps, notes on responsiveness, language that sounded reasonable if you didn't know the context or the omissions behind it. What struck me wasn't the content, it was the process. This hadn't been a reaction to a single incident. It was a narrative that had been forming quietly, without my participation. A story about me, written by people who hadn't spoken to me directly about any of it. And suddenly, so many things made sense. The shifted tone, the narrowed scope of my involvement, the assumptions that my silence meant disengagement. They hadn't misread me recently. They had reclassified me. I sat there longer than I meant to, staring at the screen, noticing how calm I felt. My pulse didn't spike. My hands didn't tense. What I felt instead was something closer to relief, because this wasn't ambiguous anymore. It also explained something else I'd sensed but hadn't yet named. My name circulated before I was even informed. Decisions about my performance, my role, my future. All discussed, aligned on, and documented, without a single direct conversation with me. That was the reveal. Not that I was being criticized, but that I was no longer part of the feedback loop at all. In that moment, I understood the full cost of invisibility. Not just in recognition, but in agency. When you're quiet long enough, people stop checking whether their assumptions are accurate. They fill in the gaps themselves. And once those assumptions are written down, they gain weight. I didn't forward the email. I didn't reply. I didn't confront anyone. I saved it, along with the timestamps, the participant list, the earlier threads that contradicted its conclusions, not as ammunition, as context. That night, I went home and slept normally. No spiraling, no rehearsed arguments. I woke up the next morning with an unexpected sense of steadiness, because now I wasn't guessing anymore. The system had revealed itself completely. I knew where conversations about me were happening. I knew how my behavior was being interpreted. I knew that my silence had been reframed, not as professionalism, but as a liability. And most importantly, I knew that nothing I said casually would correct this. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved with reassurance. It was a documented narrative, one that would now follow me unless it was addressed deliberately. That realization narrowed my options. I could react emotionally and confirm the version of me they were quietly building. I could over-explain and look defensive. Or I could do something else entirely, something slower, more precise. Irreversible. For the first time since this all began, I wasn't just observing, I was deciding. Once you see the full picture, indecision becomes its own kind of action. That was the space I found myself in after the reveal. Not panicked, not reactive, but acutely aware that whatever I did next would set a direction that couldn't easily be reversed. The system had already moved. The question was whether I would try to run alongside it, or step out of its path entirely. I laid out my options carefully, not emotionally, logically. The first option was to confront it head-on, request a meeting, present the email, ask why I hadn't been included in the discussion. On paper, that looked reasonable. Professional even, but I knew how that conversation would go. There would be surprise, apologies, careful language about process gaps and misalignment. They would assure me it wasn't personal, that they'd meant to loop me in later, that the documentation was preliminary, and then nothing fundamental would change. Because once a narrative exists, correcting it verbally only shifts tone, not structure. The record would still be there. The assumptions would still linger. I'd be marked as someone who pushed back only after being excluded, not someone whose voice was integral from the start. The second option was to adapt, become louder, more visible. Proactively reinsert myself into every conversation, signal engagement unmistakably. This too had a cost. It would look like overcompensation. A sudden change in behavior invites scrutiny. It would validate the idea that my earlier silence had been a problem to fix, rather than a misinterpretation to correct. And more importantly, it would require me to perform a version of myself that wasn't sustainable. The third option was the quietest and the most final: do nothing publicly. Continue fulfilling my role exactly as defined. Let the documentation stand. Let the system operate on its assumptions, but prepare to exit on my own terms. That option didn't come from anger, it came from self-respect. I realized that what had been broken wasn't trust. It was process integrity. Feedback given without conversation. Decisions made without participation. Those weren't errors. They were signals about how the organization functioned under pressure. And I didn't want to spend the next chapter of my career correcting a system that required invisibility to run smoothly. So I chose the irreversible option. I didn't announce it. I didn't hint at it. I simply began aligning my actions with a future that didn't include this role. That meant tightening boundaries, declining work that fell outside my formal scope, asking for written clarification when responsibilities were ambiguous, responding to assumptions with neutral questions instead of silent compliance. It also meant something more practical. I began preparing my departure, not in haste, but with care, updating my records, reviewing contracts, understanding notice periods and obligations, making sure that when I eventually stepped away, it would be clean, professional, undeniable. This wasn't a threat, it was a choice. What surprised me was how calm that decision made me feel. Once I stopped trying to fix the narrative, the emotional weight lifted. I no longer needed to prove anything. I no longer needed to correct perceptions that had already solidified without me. I simply needed to act consistently with what I now knew, There's a strange freedom in realizing you don't have to win an argument you were never invited into, that you can opt out of dynamics that depend on your silence to function. I continued going to work every day, continued doing my job well. No drop in quality, no change in demeanor. If anything, I became more composed. Because I wasn't waiting anymore, I had chosen my direction. And from that point on, every action I took, even the quiet ones, was aligned with that choice. Not to expose, not to retaliate, but to step away from a system that had already decided who I was without asking. The consequences of that decision wouldn't be immediate. They rarely are, but they were already in motion. Once the decision was made, nothing needed to be said. That was the paradox. The most significant shift in my professional life happened without an announcement, without a meeting, without a single sentence spoken out loud. From the outside, everything looked stable, predictable, normal. Inside, everything had already moved. I began operating with precision. Not secrecy, precision. Every action I took was deliberate, documented, and aligned with the version of my role that existed on paper, not the version people had grown accustomed to benefiting from. I stopped absorbing ambiguity. When tasks came to me vaguely framed, "Can you just take a look?" I asked clarifying questions, not defensively, neutrally. What's the expected outcome? Who's accountable for final approval? Is this within my scope or advisory? Those questions slowed things down, not dramatically. Just enough to expose how often clarity had been replaced by assumption. Some people adjusted, others grew impatient. A few seemed unsettled, as if the ground rules had changed without their consent. They had. I stopped attending meetings where my presence was symbolic rather than functional. If there was no agenda, no request for input, no defined decision point, I declined. Politely, consistently, without explanation beyond availability and scope. No one challenged me on it. They didn't yet realize what they were losing. I also began shifting how I communicated. Everything important went into writing. Summaries followed conversations. Decisions were restated plainly, without interpretation. If something wasn't confirmed explicitly, I treated it as undecided. This had an effect. People became more careful around me, not warmer, more exact. They started looping me in earlier, not out of respect, but out of necessity. They needed the paper trail, they needed the certainty. I provided it, but I no longer provided the cushioning. When risks emerged that I would have previously mitigated quietly, I surfaced them exactly once, in writing, and then stepped back. If they were ignored, I didn't revisit them unless asked. That wasn't negligence, it was boundary enforcement. Meanwhile, outside the day-to-day, I continued preparing. I spoke with no one at work about my plans. I didn't test the waters. I didn't seek reassurance. I updated my resume carefully, framing my experience accurately, not modestly. I reconnected with contacts who knew my work beyond this environment. I didn't rush. Moving in silence requires patience. The most telling part was how little attention any of this drew. People noticed changes in outcomes before they noticed changes in behavior. Things took longer. Questions lingered. Dependencies became visible. Still, no one connected it to me. They assumed complexity had increased, or that the organization was simply growing, or that someone else had dropped the ball. That anonymity was part of the leverage. I was still fulfilling my role, still dependable, still calm. But now, the value I provided was traceable, and traceability changes how systems behave. By the time anyone sensed a shift, it was already normalized. That was intentional. If I left suddenly, it would have been disruptive, but temporary. By moving slowly, aligning everything to documented expectations, I allowed the system to adjust without the invisible supports it had relied on. I wasn't pulling out a pillar, I was removing the scaffolding. And scaffolding, once gone, reveals how sound the structure really is. There was no satisfaction in this, no sense of superiority. Just a quiet certainty that I was acting with integrity, toward myself, if nothing else. I didn't know yet how others would respond once the consequences became undeniable, but I knew one thing for certain. When the time came, no one would be able to say they hadn't been informed. Everything was already written down. The consequences didn't arrive loudly. There was no sudden crisis, no all-hands meeting, no message marked urgent with my name in the subject line. What changed first was something more subtle: rhythm. Things that used to move smoothly began to hesitate. Decisions stalled. Not because no one was capable, but because no one was quite sure who had final authority. Questions circled longer than they used to. Tasks bounced between teams with polite notes attached, each one nudging responsibility just a little further away. At first, this was framed as growing pains. We're just adjusting. Processes are evolving. There's a lot happening at once. I listened. I nodded. I continued doing exactly what was asked of me. No more, no less. The first real sign came during a routine review. A metric that usually stayed within range had drifted. Not catastrophically, just enough to prompt discussion. Someone asked how long it had been trending that way. No one knew. Someone else asked whether there had been a sign-off on a recent change. There was a pause. I was in the meeting. I said nothing until directly addressed. When I was, I answered plainly. That change didn't go through my review. No accusation, no emphasis, just a fact. The room adjusted around that sentence. People glanced at their notes. Someone said they thought it had been aligned already. Another said maybe it was covered in a separate thread. It wasn't. That was the first time I saw discomfort replace confidence. After that, similar moments accumulated. A missed dependency here, an untracked assumption there. Small things, but each one required extra time to resolve. Extra meetings, extra explanations. The system was feeling the absence of something it couldn't quite name. What was interesting was who felt it first. Not leadership, middle layers. The people who had relied most heavily on my quiet corrections, often without realizing it, were now the ones fielding questions they couldn't easily answer. They reached out more often, but with a different tone. Not casual, careful. Just want to make sure we're aligned. Can you confirm whether this was approved? Do you recall why this was set up this way? I answered honestly, and only what I knew directly. Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it was no. Sometimes it was, that context wasn't documented. Each response landed differently. No one accused me of withholding, because I wasn't. I was simply no longer interpolating. What I noticed most was how often people assumed the gap was temporary, that someone, eventually, would step in and smooth it out. They didn't realize that someone had always been me, and I had stopped doing that quietly. Weeks passed. Leadership began asking for clearer reports, more detail, more certainty. The tone shifted from confident to cautious, not alarmed, but aware that things were less predictable than before. In one meeting, a manager said, half joking, "It feels like we're missing a layer of glue lately." No one laughed. I felt no satisfaction hearing that, only confirmation, because glue isn't structural. It's compensatory. It holds things together when design is incomplete. And once it's gone, the flaws don't explode. They reveal themselves. The flaws don't yauqid. Still, no one connected this back to me. Why would they? From their perspective, I was still present, still calm, still reliable. There was no dramatic withdrawal to point to, just a gradual increase in friction spread across teams and timelines. Blame diffused. That diffusion was important. It meant no one could pin the consequences on a single person or decision. They were systemic, and systemic issues don't get fixed with scapegoats. They require examination. That examination had begun, and once it did, the question of how things had been running so smoothly before became unavoidable. The answer just hadn't reached the surface yet. By the time the pattern was visible, it had already settled in. That's the thing about slow consequences. They don't feel urgent until they're embedded. What had begun as mild friction had now become a consistent drag. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to demand attention. Enough that leadership could no longer attribute it to coincidence or growth alone. The questions changed, not what went wrong, but why it kept happening. Meetings multiplied. Reviews became more granular. Requests for documentation increased. There was a new emphasis on traceability, on understanding how decisions were being made and by whom. On the surface, this looked like improvement. Underneath, it was panic in a controlled tone. People started reaching out to me more directly, not casually, with intent. Can we get your thoughts on this? Just want to sanity check before we finalize. We realized you might have historical context here. That last one came up often. I did have historical context. I had always had it. The difference was that now, it was being requested explicitly, rather than assumed as something I would automatically provide. I gave it when asked, but something fundamental had changed. The requests were coming too late. They were asking for insight after decisions had already been drafted, after timelines had been announced, after commitments had been made. They wanted validation, not collaboration, and validation wasn't something I could give retroactively. In one instance, I was asked to review a process that had already been communicated externally. I flagged a risk, calmly, clearly. Writing. The response came back quickly. Understood, but at this point we're too far along to revisit. Too far along. That phrase stayed with me because it captured the moment perfectly. They were finally asking the right questions, but the window to act on the answers had closed. I noticed a shift in tone toward me, more careful, almost deferential, as if they sensed that something had changed, but didn't yet understand what. A manager scheduled a one-on-one just to reconnect. The conversation was polite, exploratory, questions about my workload, my engagement, whether I felt supported. I answered honestly, but narrowly. I didn't mention the internal email. I didn't bring up the narrative that had been written without me. I didn't ask for reassurance. Support wasn't the issue anymore. The issue was timing. Once trust is replaced by documentation, you can't simply revert to informality. Once silence has been reframed as risk, it doesn't get reinterpreted as professionalism overnight. They were trying to fix a structural problem with relational gestures, and didn't work. I could see the realization forming slowly, in side glances during meetings, in the way some people hesitated before speaking, in the sudden care with which emails were written. They were trying to rebuild something they hadn't known they were dismantling. But the conditions had changed. I was no longer operating from assumption. They were no longer operating from certainty. That asymmetry mattered. By the time leadership acknowledged that my role had been undervalued, not verbally, but procedurally, it was already clear that reintegrating me wouldn't restore what had been lost, because the system now expected everything to be explicit. And explicit systems don't rely on quiet people. They rely on defined ones. I remember sitting in a meeting where someone suggested formalizing responsibilities that had previously been handled informally. The irony wasn't lost on me. Informally meant invisibly. Invisibly meant without consent. Formalizing it now wouldn't change the past. It would only confirm what I had already understood. That the way things had worked before depended on someone doing more than was acknowledged, and less than was protected. They were too late to fix it because they were trying to fix outcomes instead of addressing origin. And I wasn't interested in reopening that origin story anymore. I had already stepped beyond it. What remained was a kind of quiet tension. Not hostile, just unresolved. The sense that something important had shifted, and no one was quite sure how to name it. I knew, and soon, they would too. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. There was no raised voice, no accusations, no attempt to corner me with justifications or apologies. It arrived the way most things did in that environment. Calendar invite first, meaning later. Quick sync! I accepted it without hesitation. When I joined the meeting, there were two people present, both senior enough to matter, both careful with language. The tone was neutral, almost gentle, as if they were approaching something fragile without naming it directly. They started by thanking me for my consistency, for my institutional knowledge, for holding things together during periods of change. I listened without interrupting. Then one of them paused and said, "We've noticed you've been a bit quieter lately." I nodded, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. They continued, choosing their words slowly. They mentioned alignment, engagement, the importance of collaboration. They asked if everything was okay, if there was something they should be aware of. This was the opening. I didn't bring up the internal email. I didn't reference the write-up. I didn't recount the moments of exclusion. I didn't need to, I said calmly. I've been operating within my defined scope. There was a brief silence. I added, when decisions affect my area, I respond when I'm asked. When they don't, I assume alignment has already happened. That was it. No emotion, no emphasis, just a description of behavior. One of them asked whether I felt sufficiently looped in. I answered honestly, I'm looped in when it's required. Another pause. They exchanged a glance, not defensive, but thoughtful. As if they were finally hearing something that had been present all along, but unspoken. One of them said, that wasn't our intention. I believed them. So I replied, I didn't assume it was. That seemed to disarm them more than anything else could have. We talked for another 15 minutes. About process, about expectations, about how things had evolved. There were no confessions, no attempts to rewrite history, just a mutual recognition that something had drifted and that the drift had consequences. At one point, one of them asked carefully, what would you need to feel more engaged again? I considered the question, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew how it would land. And then I said, I don't think this is about engagement. They waited. I think it's about clarity, I continued, about when input is needed and when it isn't. I've adjusted to what the system requires. I didn't say more. I didn't need to explain that my adjustment was permanent. The meeting ended politely, cordially, with thanks and vague intentions to revisit some structures. No promises, no urgency, just awareness. After I left the call, I felt nothing in particular. No relief, no vindication, because the confrontation hadn't been about winning anything. It had been about alignment, finally, explicitly. They now knew that my silence wasn't accidental. I knew that they understood that. That was enough. There's a power in restraint that doesn't come from dominance, but from coherence. From saying only what's true, and no more than necessary. From letting the weight of clarity do the work instead of emotion. I returned to my day unchanged. The work continued. The system continued, but something subtle had settled into place. They could no longer tell themselves they hadn't noticed. I didn't become someone else after all of this. That's the part people often expect. A reinvention. A sharper edge. A visible shift in personality. But that never happened. I didn't harden. I didn't grow cynical. I didn't trade calm for distance or restraint for resentment. What changed was internal alignment. I know who I am now, and I no longer negotiate that through silence. I'm still composed, still deliberate, still someone who listens more than he speaks. But I no longer confuse being calm with being available. I don't assume responsibility without agreement. I don't carry weight that hasn't been formally placed in my hands. And I don't fill gaps that exist because others chose speed over clarity. That distinction matters. Before, I defined myself by usefulness, by how seamlessly I could support outcomes without becoming visible in the process. I took pride in being the person who made things work quietly. Now I define myself by coherence. If my name is attached to something, my voice is part of it. If my expertise is relied upon, my participation is explicit. If I'm not included, I don't infer obligation. That shift didn't make me louder, it made me precise. At work, people interact with me differently now. Not dramatically, but consciously. There's more structure around conversations. More explicit requests, less assumption. It's not warmer, but it's cleaner. And I'm okay. Deal with that. I no longer need to be indispensable. Indispensability is fragile. It depends on being unseen until you're gone. I'd rather be defined than depended on. What surprised me most was how much energy returned once I stopped managing perception. Once I stopped trying to be easy. Once I accepted that clarity sometimes creates discomfort, and that discomfort isn't my responsibility to resolve. Outside of work, this shift followed me. I'm clearer in conversations. I ask for what I need. I don't soften boundaries to preserve harmony. I let silence exist without rushing to fill it, and I've learned that when you stop over-explaining, people listen more carefully when you do speak. There's no bitterness in this, no sense of loss. If anything, there's gratitude for the clarity that only arrives when things break quietly instead of loudly. When you're forced to confront not just how others see you, but how you've taught them to. I don't regret being patient, or calm, or generous with my effort, but I no longer confuse generosity with erasure. Who I am now is someone who understands systems, not just how they function, but how they interpret behavior. Someone who knows that silence always means something, whether you intend it to or not. And someone who chooses, deliberately, what his silence will mean. I didn't need to dominate the room to reclaim myself. I didn't need to expose anyone. I didn't need to be vindicated. I just needed to stop participating in my own invisibility. That choice changed everything that mattered. There's a quiet lesson in all of this that took me a long time to understand. Most harm in professional spaces doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from convenience, from systems that reward speed over clarity, and from people who confuse silence with consent because it makes decisions easier. No one in my story set out to erase me. They didn't need to. I participated in it, by being adaptable when I should have been explicit, by being patient when I should have asked to be included, by believing that doing good work would eventually correct how I was perceived. Sometimes it doesn't. Silence is powerful, but it's not neutral. It always sends a signal, and if you don't choose what that signal is, someone else will. What I learned is this. Being underestimated isn't the danger. Being undefined is. When people don't know where you stand, they'll decide for you. They'll assign roles, intentions, even narratives. Often without realizing they're doing it. And once those narratives are written down, they don't disappear just because you disagree with them. That doesn't mean the answer is confrontation, or loudness, or proving anything to anyone. It means choosing coherence over convenience. making sure your actions, your boundaries, and your presence all point in the same direction. I didn't correct the story that was written about me by arguing with it. I corrected it by stepping out of the conditions that allowed it to exist. That's quiet dominance. Not control over others, but control over participation. The ability to decide where your energy goes and where it doesn't. The willingness to let systems feel the weight of their own assumptions. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after listening to this, it's this. If you're always the one smoothing things over, ask yourself who benefits from that smoothness and what it's costing you. If you're always the last to be informed, pay attention. Not with resentment, but with curiosity. That pattern is telling you something. And if your name is moving through rooms you're not invited into, remember this. You don't owe silence to a system that refuses clarity. Sometimes the most self-respecting thing you can do is stop compensating. I'm curious. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that a story about you was being written without your voice? If you have, I'd like to hear how you handled it.